I'm 79 years old now, and before you scroll away or dismiss what I'm about to say, I want you to sit with me for just a moment, because this isn't something you hear often, and it certainly isn't something most people are brave enough to admit out loud. When I was young, I believed that having someone by your side was the ultimate proof that you were doing life right. I believed that being chosen by a man meant I was worthy, complete, and somehow safer in this world. But after nearly 8 decades of living, loving, losing, and learning, I need to tell you something that may sound uncomfortable at first. You don't need a man to complete your life. Not now. Not ever. My name is Eleanor. I spent most of my life as a school librarian in a small town, surrounded by stories, yet somehow missing the truth of my own. I was married once for over 30 years. After my husband passed, I thought companionship was something I needed again to feel whole. I told myself it was natural, even necessary. After all, that's what we're taught, isn't it? That life is meant to be shared, that being alone is something to fix, something to escape. So when I met someone a few years later, I convinced myself it was a second chance at happiness. But what I didn't realize back then, and what I wish someone had told me when I was still young enough to shape my life differently, is that not all companionship brings peace. Sometimes it quietly takes it away. When I was in my 20s, I used to watch older couples walking together in the park. I would imagine myself growing old like that, hand in hand, still laughing, still connected. It felt like the natural ending to a life well lived. Back then, love seemed simple. You meet someone, you build a life, and you stay. That was the dream I carried with me for years. As I moved through my 30s and 40s, life became less about dreams and more about responsibilities. I raised 2 children, managed a household, worked long hours at the library, and supported my husband through his own struggles. I rarely stopped to ask myself what I truly needed. I just kept going, doing what I thought was expected of me, being a good wife, a good mother, a reliable partner. And somewhere along the way, I got used to putting myself last. When my husband passed away in my early 60s, the silence in the house was unbearable at first. Not just the absence of his voice, but the absence of routine, of shared moments, of having someone there. I remember sitting at the kitchen table one morning, staring at an empty chair, and thinking, is this what the rest of my life will look like? That fear settled deep inside me. So, when a man came into my life not long after, I welcomed him more quickly than I should have. He was charming in the beginning. He made me laugh, asked about my day, told me I deserved happiness again. And after years of caregiving and loss, those words felt like sunlight after a long winter. I told myself I was lucky, that at my age finding someone was rare, that I shouldn't question it too much. But here's something I didn't understand back then. When you spend your whole life adjusting yourself to fit others, you don't even notice when you start doing it again. In the early days, I was careful not to seem too serious. I kept conversations light, avoided talking about my fears or the deeper parts of myself. I wanted things to stay easy, pleasant. I didn't want to scare him away. It sounds foolish now, but at the time it felt necessary. I thought, at this stage in life, no one wants complications. So I laughed when I was tired. I agreed when I wanted to disagree. I listened when he spoke, but hesitated when it was my turn to be heard. I told myself it was just part of being in a relationship. That compromise was normal. But slowly, without realizing it, I began to shrink again. I remember one evening very clearly. We were sitting in my living room, and I tried to bring up something that had been on my mind. I had been thinking a lot about the future, about what companionship really meant at our age, about how we could support each other in deeper ways. Before I could finish, he smiled and said, "Let's not get too serious, Eleanor. We're too old for heavy conversations. Let's just enjoy what we have." At the time, I nodded. I even smiled back, but something inside me went quiet. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind of quiet that comes when you realize a part of you isn't welcome. That was the moment I should have paid attention, but I didn't. Because I was afraid. Afraid that if I asked for more, I would lose what little I had. Afraid that being alone again would feel worse than feeling unseen. When I look back now, I can see how much of my life was shaped by that fear. Not just in that relationship, but in many choices I made when I was younger too. The fear of being alone can be louder than your own needs if you let it. It can convince you to accept less than you deserve, to stay in places that slowly drain you, all because you believe the alternative is worse. But here's the truth I learned far too late. Being alone is not the same as being lonely, and being with someone who doesn't truly see you can be the loneliest place of all. As the months went on, I started to notice how tired I felt, not physically, but emotionally. Conversations that once felt exciting began to feel like obligations. I found myself preparing for phone calls, thinking about what to say, what not to say, how to keep things light. I wasn't being myself. I was managing an experience, and that's when it finally hit me. After all those years of living, loving, and losing, I had walked right back into a pattern I thought I had outgrown. I was still trying to earn my place in someone else's life instead of honoring my own. If I could sit across from my younger self now, I would tell her something very simple. I would say, "Eleanor, one day you will realize that your peace is more valuable than anyone's approval. Don't wait until you're almost 80 to understand that. But life doesn't work that way, does it? We learn when we learn, and sometimes those lessons come after we've already paid the price." So if you're listening to me right now, whether you're young or closer to my age, I want you to think about something. Not what you've been told you need, not what society expects, but what truly brings you peace. Because that's what matters in the end. Not the title of a relationship, not the appearance of companionship, but the quiet, steady feeling that you are at home in your own life. I didn't understand that when I was young. I thought love meant giving more, trying harder, holding on tighter. I didn't know that sometimes love means letting go. Letting go of expectations, of roles that no longer fit, of people who only accept parts of you. When I was young, I believed that being chosen was everything. Now, I know that choosing yourself is where real life begins, and I wish more than anything that I had learned that sooner. As the years went on, what I once called companionship slowly began to feel like a quiet obligation I carried every day. It didn't happen all at once. That's the dangerous part. These things rarely arrive as storms. They arrive as small shifts, little compromises, tiny silences you convince yourself don't matter, until one day you realize you've drifted far from who you really are. I remember waking up one morning feeling unusually tired, not the kind of tired sleep can fix, but the kind that sits in your chest, the kind that makes even simple things feel heavy. I hadn't done anything physically demanding, yet I felt drained before the day even began. And as I sat there with my tea growing cold in my hands, I asked myself a question I had been avoiding for months. Why do I feel like this? The answer didn't come immediately, but over time it revealed itself in quiet, uncomfortable truths. I wasn't just living my life anymore, I was adjusting it, rearranging it, making space for someone who, if I was honest, wasn't doing the same for me. He would call late at night, long after I had settled into my routine. At first I thought it was sweet. He said he couldn't sleep, that talking to me made him feel better. And I wanted to be kind. I had spent most of my life being the one people leaned on. It felt familiar, almost natural. So I picked up the phone night after night, but those conversations slowly became something else. They weren't about connection. They were about release, but only his. He would talk about his past, his disappointments, his children who didn't visit enough, his health concerns, his frustrations, and I would listen. I always listened. But when I tried to share something of my own, he would gently redirect the conversation back to himself, as if my inner world was too inconvenient to explore. One evening after we hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't move. I just sat there and noticed how I felt. And for the first time, I allowed myself to admit it. I felt heavier, not comforted, not supported, just heavier. That realization frightened me because it meant I had walked into something I couldn't easily justify anymore. But instead of stepping away, I did what many women do. I made excuses. I told myself he was going through a difficult time, that he needed patience, that at our age, everyone carries some kind of burden. And while all of that may have been true, I ignored the most important truth of all. I was carrying his burdens and no one was helping me carry mine. And then there were the smaller things, the kind you almost feel silly mentioning, but they add up over time. Changing my schedule to fit his, eating later than I preferred because he liked late dinners, skipping my weekly book club because he said those gatherings were a bit dull. I told myself these were minor adjustments, but each one took a small piece of my independence with it. I remember the day I realized just how much I had changed. I was speaking to an old friend on the phone, someone who had known me for decades. At one point, she paused and said, "You sound different, Eleanor. Quieter. Are you all right?" That question stayed with me long after the call ended, because deep down I knew she was right. I had become quieter, not because I had found peace, but because I had stopped expressing parts of myself that no longer felt welcome. And then came the moment that shifted everything. We were sitting together one afternoon and I mentioned something I had been exploring on my own. I had started reading about emotional healing, about understanding patterns from the past. It was something that made me feel alive again, like I was discovering parts of myself I had ignored for years. But when I shared this with him, he laughed softly and said, "You're overthinking things again. Why can't you just relax and enjoy life? You used to be so easygoing." Those words may not sound harsh at first, but they landed heavily, because what he was really saying was that my growth made him uncomfortable, that the version of me he preferred was the one who asked fewer questions, who stayed light, who didn't challenge anything. And in that moment, something became very clear to me. I had a choice to make. I could continue shrinking myself to maintain the relationship, or I could allow myself to grow even if it meant losing him. That choice is not easy, especially when you've been taught your whole life that keeping the relationship is the priority. That compromise is a virtue even when it costs you your voice. But there comes a point when the cost becomes too high. What many people don't talk about is how relationships later in life can quietly freeze you. Not because of age, but because of the dynamics you accept. When you're finally at a stage where you can explore who you truly are, the wrong person can pull you back into old roles. The caregiver, the listener, the one who adapts. And if you're not careful, you start editing yourself again. You think twice before sharing your thoughts. You hold back your opinions. You avoid anything that might disrupt the fragile balance of the relationship. And without realizing it, you stop growing. I began to notice how often I hesitated before speaking. how often I chose silence over honesty. And each time I did, a quiet voice inside me would whisper, "This isn't who you are." But I had ignored that voice before. For years, in different forms, in different relationships, this time I couldn't ignore it anymore. There was also the matter of something people rarely discuss openly, especially at our age: the financial and practical side of these relationships. It starts subtly: paying for small things, covering dinners, helping out here and there. You tell yourself it's generosity, that it doesn't matter, but over time, those small gestures can turn into expectations. He would mention how complicated his finances were, how difficult things had been since his last relationship, and without being asked directly, I found myself stepping in, offering help, paying for things he couldn't manage at the moment. I didn't keep track, I didn't question it, because I didn't want to seem unkind. But kindness, when it isn't balanced, can quietly turn into self-neglect. One afternoon, as I was reviewing my monthly expenses, I noticed how much had changed. Not dramatically, but enough to make me pause. And for the first time, I asked myself, is this what I worked all those years for? To spend this stage of my life supporting someone who isn't truly supporting me? That question stayed with me. It lingered in my thoughts, in my quiet moments, in the spaces where I could no longer distract myself from the truth. But the most difficult realization of all wasn't about money or time or even energy. It was about something much deeper. It was the realization that I had slowly started to believe I needed this relationship more than I actually did. That belief is powerful, and it doesn't come from nowhere. It's built over years of conditioning, of stories we're told about loneliness, about aging, about what it means to be alone. It whispers to you, at this stage in life, you should be grateful. Don't ask for too much. Don't risk losing what you have. And if you listen to that voice long enough, you begin to accept less. Not because you don't deserve more, but because you've been convinced that more is no longer available to you. That is the trap. Not the relationship itself, but the belief that you cannot do better, or that being alone is worse than being unfulfilled. I carried that belief longer than I'd like to admit. It kept me in a place where I was giving more than I was receiving, where I was present but not truly seen, where I was kind but not truly valued. And the hardest part? From the outside, everything looked fine. We laughed. We spent time together. There were moments that felt comfortable, even pleasant. But comfort is not the same as fulfillment. And occasional happiness is not the same as deep, meaningful connection. It took me a long time to understand that. And by the time I did, I realized I was standing at a quiet turning point in my life. One that didn't come with drama or confrontation, but with a simple, undeniable truth. I could no longer continue like this without losing something essential within myself. I remember the exact morning when everything inside me finally became clear. There was no argument, no dramatic ending, no harsh words exchanged, just silence and a kind of honesty I had been avoiding for far too long. The sun was just beginning to rise, and I was sitting by the window with my tea, the same way I had done for years. But that morning felt different. The house was quiet, my phone wasn't ringing, and for once I wasn't waiting for it to. I wasn't checking the time, wondering when he would call, or thinking about what I should say when he did. I was just there. And in that stillness, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Peace, not excitement, not distraction, not temporary comfort, real, steady peace. The kind that doesn't ask anything from you, the kind that doesn't make you perform or adjust or shrink. And as I sat there holding that feeling, a simple question came to me. If this is how I feel without him, then what exactly am I holding on to? That question changed everything because for the first time, I wasn't thinking about the relationship in terms of what it used to be or what it could become. I was seeing it for what it actually was. And what it was something that required me to give more than I had left to give. You see, when you reach this stage in life, something very important shifts. Your time is no longer something you assume you have plenty of. Your energy becomes more valuable. Your peace becomes sacred. And anything that disturbs that peace starts to feel expensive, not just emotionally, but deeply personally expensive. I had spent decades of my life giving to my family, to my work, to the people I loved, and I don't regret that. Not at all. There is beauty in giving, there is meaning in caring for others, but what I didn't understand back then was this giving should not cost you yourself. And somewhere along the way in that relationship I started to see things more clearly after that morning. Not in a bitter way, not with anger, but with a quiet kind of clarity that only comes when you finally stop lying to yourself. I saw how often I had silenced my own thoughts just to keep things smooth. How many times I had ignored that small voice inside me that said, "This doesn't feel right." How I had mistaken his occasional attention for real care, his presence for true partnership. And the hardest truth of all, I had accepted it. Not because I didn't know better, but because a part of me was still afraid. Afraid that if I let go, I would be alone in a way that felt permanent. But here's what I discovered, and I need you to really hear this. The fear of being alone can make you accept a life that feels half-lived. It can convince you that crumbs are enough. That inconsistency is normal. That being good enough for now is the same as being truly valued. But it's not. And once you see that clearly, you cannot unsee it. I thought about all the women I had known over the years, friends, neighbors, women from my work. So many of them had settled into relationships that looked fine on the outside, but quietly drained them on the inside. Not because they were weak, but because they were kind, because they were patient, because they believed love meant enduring. But love, real love, does not ask you to abandon yourself. It does not make you feel like you have to earn your place in someone's life over and over again. It does not shrink you. And that's when I understood something that changed the way I saw everything. At this stage of life, love should feel sacred, not casual, not convenient, not something you hold on to out of habit or fear. Sacred, meaning it protects your peace. It respects your boundaries. It meets you where you are, not where you used to be. It sees the full depth of who you've become and doesn't ask you to become smaller just to make it comfortable. Anything less than that is not worth the cost. I didn't come to that realization easily. It took years of living, of repeating patterns, of ignoring my own needs, but once it settled in, I knew I couldn't go back. Letting go of that relationship wasn't dramatic. There was no final confrontation, no long explanation, just a quiet decision made with clarity instead of fear. I stopped answering every late night call. I stopped rearranging my life. I stopped offering parts of myself that weren't being respected. And eventually the connection faded. Not because I forced it to end, but because I finally stopped feeding something that wasn't nourishing me. And do you know what happened after that? Nothing terrible. That's what surprised me the most. The loneliness I had feared didn't consume me. The silence I had once dreaded became something gentle, something healing. My days became my own again. My thoughts felt clearer. My energy slowly returned. I started doing small things just for myself. Reading in the afternoon without interruption. taking walks without checking my phone, sitting in quiet rooms without feeling like something was missing. And in those moments, I realized something I wish I had known much earlier in life. Being alone is not a problem to solve. It can be a space to rediscover who you are without noise, without pressure, without expectations. And from that place, everything changes. Because when you no longer fear being alone, you stop accepting what doesn't honor you. You stop settling, you stop chasing, you start choosing. And that is where your real power is. So if you're listening to me right now, I want you to ask yourself something honestly. Not what you've been told to want, not what others expect from you, but what truly feels right for your life as it is today. Do you want a relationship that adds peace to your life, or are you holding on to something just to avoid being alone? Because those are not the same thing. You deserve a kind of love that feels steady, respectful, and whole. Not something you have to constantly adjust yourself for. Not something that leaves you feeling uncertain or unseen. And if that kind of love doesn't come, that does not mean you have failed. It means you have chosen yourself. There is a quiet strength in that, a dignity that no relationship can replace. I look back now at the woman I was in my younger years, the one who believed being chosen by someone else was the highest form of validation. The one who shaped herself to fit what others needed, hoping it would lead to lasting love. I don't judge her. She was doing what she thought was right. But I do wish I could sit beside her, take her hand, and say gently, "One day you will understand that your life is not meant to be spent proving your worth to anyone. It is meant to be lived in a way that honors who you are." It took me nearly 80 years to fully understand that. But I understand it now, and I carry that truth with me in the quiet mornings, in the stillness of my home, in the peace I no longer take for granted. You are not incomplete without someone beside you. You are not running out of time. You are not too much or too late. You are simply at a point in your life where your peace matters more than your fear. And from this moment forward, you have permission to protect that peace, to say no, to walk away, to choose differently, to choose yourself. Because in the end, the most important relationship you will ever have is the one you build with your own life. And when that relationship is strong, honest, and peaceful, you no longer look for someone to complete you. You only allow someone in if they truly add to what you already have. And that, my dear, is not loneliness. That is freedom.